On Sunday, September 3rd, 1939, as Britain declared war on Germany, the German submarine U-30 torpedoed the ocean liner SS Athenia in the North Atlantic. There were 128 fatalities, 28 of them American, the first casualties in the longest campaign of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic. At stake, control of the Atlantic sea lanes between Britain and North America. It would be a conflict of raw courage and a test of rival technology. Above all, it would be a struggle against the harsh Atlantic Ocean. The turning point of the whole campaign would hinge around one battle in May 1943. Two veteran submariners of World War I, German Grand Admiral Karl Doenitz and British Naval Commander Admiral Sir Max Horton, would confront each other in this critical clash of warriors. At the beginning of World War II, the Germans believed that Britain would be brought to its knees by paralyzing its maritime trade. In autumn 1939, the German submarine fleet had only 57 U-boats, with just 26 at sea. Initially, Hitler believed that his surface fleet would dominate the sea war, so U-boat production was given a lower priority. This strategy would later prove disastrous. Had the U-boat arm been stronger at the outbreak of war, the German offensive in the Atlantic could have quickly defeated Britain. The British Royal Navy believed that convoys, which had proved significant during World War I, and ASDIC, or sonar, a system for detecting submarines underwater, would neutralize the U-boat threat. But in 1939, the British lacked sufficient escorts for all ships to sail in a convoy. Consequently, the U-boats were able to concentrate on the numerous vessels sailing alone. By the end of 1939, they had sunk over 100 merchant ships. 95% of them were without escort. After France fell in 1940, Admiral Karl Doenitz, commanding the German U-boats, used French Atlantic ports, giving them easier access to the mid-Atlantic. U-boat attacks escalated. Between July and October 1940, they sank 217 ships, losing only 2 of their own. In September 1940, an American gift of 50 four-stacker destroyers helped, but they were not enough to keep the U-boats at bay. The German long-range bomber, the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, posed a major threat in the air, pinpointing convoys for the U-boats to attack. As well as sinking ships itself. As Allied air cover was very limited, the Condor and Doenitz's U-boats could operate without fear of air opposition in most of the Atlantic. The threat of the German surface fleet was also present, with the cruiser Admiral Scheer sinking 17 merchantmen in one cruise at the end of 1940. In early 1941, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau carried out an even more successful cruise, disrupting the entire British convoy system. By May 1941, more British escort vessels became available. Drawing on the rapidly growing Royal Canadian Navy, convoys began to receive more protection. At the same time, patrol aircraft, such as the American-built Lockheed Hudson, were deployed to Iceland to provide more air cover over the Atlantic. Though Allied air cover did increase steadily between 1941 and early 1943, the U-boats could still operate at will in the notorious Black Gap in the mid-Atlantic. This period witnessed a savage conflict between the U-boats and Allied convoys, with fortunes ebbing and flowing like the raging sea. By April 1943, the battle for the Atlantic sea lanes reached a pivotal stage. It seemed that Doenitz's U-boats would tip to his favor. But by now, Doenitz was faced with a new and equally determined opponent, Admiral Max Horton. Both Horton and Doenitz knew that they would have to rely on past experience and cunning to outfox the other. Karl Doenitz was born in Berlin in September 1891. At age 19, he joined the German Navy and served on the battlecruiser Breslau. Doenitz left the Breslau in late 1914 and trained as a submariner. He then commanded the coastal U-boat UB-68 and operated in the Mediterranean in 1917 and 1918. During this period, the U-boat campaign came close to winning the war for Germany, a lesson the young Doenitz learned for the future. His own U-boat was sunk in October 1918. Captured and imprisoned by the British, he was released in 1920. Doenitz rose rapidly through naval ranks and was an admiral by the early 1930s. He was appointed commander of U-boats in 1935. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander-in-chief of the German Navy, believed that the surface fleet would win the Atlantic conflict. But by 1942, the surface fleet came up short. The U-boats took the leading role, and Doenitz replaced Grand Admiral Raeder as commander-in-chief in January 1943. Hitler had a very high regard for Doenitz. In turn, Doenitz remained loyal to the Führer to the end of the war. Doenitz was an excellent strategist and tactician, who also demanded the highest training and operational standards among his U-boat crews. He was devoted to his men, and they had complete faith in him. His personal touch inspired them. Max Horton was born in 1883 and also grew up with a burning ambition to go to sea. He became a dashing submarine commander during World War I, winning decorations for his bravery and skill. With his fine war record, he was swiftly promoted, and by 1937, he was commander of the Royal Navy's Reserve Fleet. By January 1940, Horton had been elevated to flag officer, submarines. In 1942, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief, Western Approaches. He was now at the forefront of the Battle of the Atlantic. Like Doenitz, he was a man of vision, energy, and imagination with a reputation for ruthlessness. Horton was determined to curb U-boat successes and reverse Doenitz's fortunes. Now, in mid-April 1943, as the Atlantic spring gales abated, both commanders were aware that a critical time in the battle had arrived. But neither realized that this would hinge on the fate of a single convoy, the ONS-5. Almost exactly 2 years before the momentous events that were about to unfold in 1943, the U-110 was forced to surrender to a British Royal Navy destroyer. Before she sank, the British were able to seize her top-secret Enigma cipher machine. This enabled them to read U-boat signals and reroute their convoys. By July 1941, shipping losses were only 20% of those in the spring, and hope returned for the convoys. Though sonar remained the main means of detecting U-boats underwater, by midsummer 1941, the British had developed new methods of thwarting them. High-frequency direction finding, known as Huff Duff, enabled them to pinpoint the U-boats through interception of their radio signals. President Franklin Roosevelt increased American aid to Britain as 1941 wore on. In July, U.S. Marines began to relieve the British garrison on Iceland. The U.S. Navy could now legitimately escort American convoys there. Inevitably, American warships were attacked. On October 17, 1941, the destroyer Kearney was badly damaged by a U-boat, and 2 weeks later, the destroyer Reuben James was sunk. America's entry into the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th heralded another high point for the U-boats. Doenitz launched an offensive in the waters off Central America and the ill-prepared U.S. eastern seaboard. Under Operation Drumroll, the U-boats sank 40 merchant ships in January 1942 alone. They later turned their attention to the Caribbean, where Doenitz's crews made easier kills. Worse, in early 1942, the U-boats introduced a new form of Enigma cipher called Triton, which outfoxed the British codebreakers. Doenitz also developed new tactics for U-boats attacking convoys. Each group of U-boats was known as a wolf pack and formed a patrol line, with the submarines positioned at 5-mile intervals. The patrol lines would then sweep eastward and westward until they contacted a convoy. Another advantage at this time was the introduction of U-boat tankers, or milk cows, which resupplied U-boats at sea, extending their length of patrol. Apart from increasing the number of escort vessels, the Allies recognized that aircraft could play a crucial role. They introduced long-range patrol aircraft, such as the American-built PBY Catalina. But the black gap in the mid-Atlantic remained, and Doenitz's U-boats continued to wreak havoc. In late 1942, over 3.5 million tons of Allied shipping went down, nearly 700 vessels, the majority in the Black Gap. Horton faced this debacle as he took over the day-to-day conduct of the Battle of the Atlantic. His burden was reinforced when the Allied leaders met at Casablanca in January 1943. They agreed that winning the Battle of the Atlantic was an essential prerequisite for the successful invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. By early March, with more and more Allied ships sinking, Horton concluded that it was no longer possible to merely evade the wolf packs. Convoys would have to fight their way through. The escorts would need to be strong and effective to survive the run. Horton therefore intensified the training of his escort crews. He also created support groups, which could be sent to reinforce any convoy under serious threat from the U-boats. Doenitz, determined to build on his successes, stepped up the number of operational U-boats. By mid-April 1943, he had 63 vessels operating in the North Atlantic alone. Their orders were to attack vital, fully laden eastbound convoys attempting to reinforce the Allied war effort in Britain and North Africa. Doenitz was convinced that his Triton codes were unbreakable. He was also obtaining timely information on convoy activity from his own intercepts of British Merchant Navy codes. He could counter Horton's efforts to reroute convoys. Doenitz increased the length of the U-boat screen in the Western Atlantic to block all possible routes. The Wolfpack swept westward to trap the eastbound convoys. Once a convoy was spotted, it would be shadowed and other U-boats were deployed with a homing signal. Doenitz aimed to inflict massive losses on the Allies. When convoy ONS-5 left Britain for Canadian ports on April 22, 1943, it consisted of over 40 merchant vessels. Most would collect cargo from North America. By now, the Allied escorts and convoys themselves were better organized. North Atlantic convoys were graded fast or slow, with only fast troop ships being permitted to travel on their own, as they could outrun the U-boats. ONS-5 was designated a slow convoy. The nerve center of Max Horton's operations was Headquarters Western Approaches, based at the English port of Liverpool. The Admiralty submarine tracking room in London covered the progress and predictions of U-boat movements. This information was then passed on to the escort commander. The convoy commander was normally a retired senior naval officer. He would brief the merchant captains before the convoy set off. On either side of the Atlantic, local escorts took the convoys out to sea. The ocean escorts then took over. The latter were made up of some 6 destroyers, corvettes, and frigates. By April 1943, they were well drilled and able to carry out combined attacks on U-boat incursions. In the early part of the war, escorts could only fire depth charges over the stern, which meant that they first had to pass the U-boat, giving it more time to evade the Allies. But in mid-1942, a system of firing multiple charges over the sides and bow, known as Hedgehog, had significantly increased the chances of a kill. But one of the most important Allied technological developments was introduced shortly before ONS-5 was due to sail. Type 271, or centimetric radar. It was capable of detecting even a U-boat periscope above the surface and in all weather. These new assets were about to be fully tested by ONS-5's escorts. The convoy was now assembling off Liverpool and would have a total of 43 merchantmen. Once ONS-5 left port and reached the open seas, it would meet up with its mid-ocean escort. This was designated B-7 and led by Commander Peter Grattan, one of the most experienced escort commanders in the destroyer HMS Duncan. There were another 6 corvettes and destroyers in the escort group. To further protect ONS-5, Horton had 2 options. He could reroute his convoys northward to avoid the Wolfpacks, but would eventually have to turn south to reach their destinations. Doenitz knew this and could deploy his U-boats to intercept the convoys. Secondly, Horton could reinforce a convoy under threat with one of his new escort support groups. But if he did this too early, Doenitz could turn his U-boats toward the less protected convoy and destroy it before the support group could be redeployed. Doenitz's wolf packs and the ships of ONS-5 were now assembling for their fateful rendezvous in the Atlantic. By April 25th, there was growing evidence of a U-boat threat to ONS-5, and Admiral Max Horton was becoming increasingly anxious about its fate. Doenitz and Horton and all their crews sensed that the moment of truth was imminent. Life on board the U-boat was difficult and fraught with danger. It was claustrophobic, and the crews required self-discipline, courage, and very strong nerves. The weather in the Atlantic was always unpredictable, and the sea was a constant, numbing enemy. U-boat crews were at sea for up to 10 weeks, with 4 to 8 weeks in port between cruises. The German people recognized their resilience and courage, and treated U-boat sailors as heroes when they came home. Once back at sea, all the comforts of home was soon forgotten. When submerged, U-boats were powered by huge electric batteries. These could only be recharged by the main diesel engine when the U-boat surfaced. Above the waves, U-boat crews had to be vigilant, as they were always vulnerable to air attack. However, experienced crews could dive within a minute. If caught on the surface, U-boats were either immediately destroyed or their crews had to fight it out. Even if they crash dived successfully, there was still the danger of enemy surface ships continuing the pursuit. If the U-boat was damaged but not sunk, there was the danger of lethal gases being released by seawater leaks when mixed with battery acid. U-boat crews knew that just one direct hit from a depth charge could shatter the vessel's hull. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. By April 1943, Doenitz's U-boat crews were weakened. Many of the experienced aces had been lost, and 50% of the crews in the North Atlantic were on their first operational cruise. Conditions for the Allied merchant seamen were equally bad. Many of the merchant ships were old and ill-equipped, and the relentless North Atlantic weather left sailors permanently soaked or freezing. Life below decks was crowded, noisy, and unpleasant. Though the ship's crews tried to relax, the grinding strain of a 24-hour vigil took its toll. For the crews of the escort ships, conditions were much the same. The corvettes especially were cramped and uncomfortable in high seas. Transatlantic convoys usually took about 2 weeks to make their passage. Calm seas were rare. Every sailor knew that the sign of a torpedo cutting through the water towards his ship might be his first and last sight of a U-boat. When a ship was hit, it would break up and sink rapidly. Any men who survived the sinking then had to take their chances in the frigid and oil-soaked sea. They would be lucky to be picked up, as rescue ships ran the danger of being torpedoed. One survivor from a torpedoed vessel recalled, "To be saved at all was beyond my dreams. The freezing water is deadly, icing you up only moments after you hit the sea. It seemed like nothing could survive. Under the watchful eye of Horton, ONS-5 steamed deeper into the North Atlantic. At the same time, Doenitz was repositioning his wolf packs. The stage was set for a momentous, perhaps decisive, showdown. By April 27, 1943, Doenitz had allowed one convoy to slip through his net, but now turned on the others, including ONS-5. The U-boats patrolling the central North Atlantic were operating in three main groups, codenamed Specht, Amsel, and Star, all totaling 40 U-boats and poised for action. Doenitz ordered them to move to their respective waiting areas to intercept ONS-5 and other convoys. ONS-5, with 43 merchant vessels, was an average-sized convoy and slow-moving. On that same day, the weather had improved sufficiently for Gretton, the ONS-5 escort commander, to refuel his and other escorts without interference. But just after midnight, Horton received bad news. Because of a change in the code settings, the British Enigma codebreakers could no longer decipher the German Triton signals. This meant a blackout of a vital intelligence source for ONS-5 until midday on May 5th. The convoy was now easy prey for Doenitz's U-boats. All Horton and the Admiralty submarine tracking room could deduce was that Doenitz's groups Amsel, Specht, and Star were in the general area off Newfoundland. They were actually further east. ONS-5 would have to rely on Huff Duff and other more traditional methods of locating U-boats. By April 28th, Gretton established that a U-boat force was shadowing ONS-5. Initially, ONS-5 had sailed north to avoid the U-boats, but now had to turn south and was running close to Doenitz's Wolfpack Group Star. Worse, it was heading straight for U-boat groups Amsel and Specht. That night, Doenitz's U-boats launched several attacks on the convoy. One merchant vessel was sunk before the escorts drove off the U-boats. On April 29th, Max Horton decided that reinforcements would be needed, and the third support group with 4 destroyers was sent to assist ONS-5. A series of Atlantic gales caused further disruption to ONS-5. By May 1st, the convoy formation was breaking up. 10 merchant ships were separated from the main body, and Gretton ordered one of his escorts, HMS Pink, to protect them. Gretton, in HMS Duncan running short of fuel, was forced to leave. ONS-5 was put in the care of Lieutenant Commander Sherwood in HMS Tay. The submarine tracking room knew enough to realize that a large U-boat force was closing in on ONS-5. Recognizing the increasing threat to the convoy, Horton took the risk of ordering another convoy support group with 8 escort vessels to assist from Canada. They left at midday on May 4th. It would take 2 days to rendezvous with the beleaguered convoy. As ONS-5 sailed south into the path of Doenitz's wolf packs, it reached a point where air cover could not be guaranteed. By now, 44 U-boats were concentrated into groups Fink and Amsel, and they were poised to strike. But as the U-boats moved in for the kill, Allied aircraft from Canada detected Group Amsel. They sank one U-boat and severely damaged two others. The remaining U-boats were undeterred and pressed on. The first contact with the convoy came that evening when a U-boat was spotted on the surface, but dived to avoid further detection. It was now clear that Group Fink was preparing to attack that night. The U-boats began to close in as darkness fell. The main part of ONS-5, consisting of 30 ships, was steaming at 7 knots in 10 columns. The U-boats now began to wreak havoc among the convoy, using the classic tactic of darting in and around the merchant ships and firing their torpedoes from close range. Despite the best efforts of the escorts, the U-boats claimed 5 merchant vessels and 1 corvette that night. Another 5 ships were torpedoed and damaged. 2 U-boats took hits and would take no further part in the action. 2 more were damaged, but were able to continue. The U-boats were by no means finished. In the early evening of May 5th, they struck again. 1 ship was sunk immediately and 2 were severely damaged. The U-boats were in their element. The situation was looking very grim for Horton. Convoy ONS-5 was facing annihilation. Doenitz ordered his U-boats to move in for the final kill. He signaled, "If there are no more steamships to be shot up, then sink the escort vessels." As ONS-5 and HMS Pink struggled to make further progress, Doenitz's U-boats surrounded them and prepared to attack. Doenitz had given his U-boat commanders carte blanche to destroy ONS-5 once and for all and deal the Allies a fatal blow. By the evening of May 5th, 1943, the British convoy ONS-5 was in dire straits. The U-boats had made 25 attacks in only 8 hours, and the convoy was facing disaster. Doenitz ordered in even more submarines. The U-boat commanders and their crews were convinced that they were on the brink of a crushing victory. Captain Hartwig Lux, commanding U-264, later said, "At this time we believed that this convoy would be absolutely dead during the next night." The U-boats began their next attacks at around 10 p.m. They were fast and furious. For a while, it seemed that ONS-5's ships were doomed. But just as the U-boats were about to consolidate their success, events changed dramatically. First, the weather closed in, and a sea mist descended on ONS-5 and its hunters. Within a couple of hours, it had become a dense fog. The U-boats were unable to attack. The surfaced U-boats were now straying close to the escorts in their desperate search for targets. Lieutenant Commander Raymond Hart in HMS Vedette received a firm sonar contact 800 yards from the convoy. He immediately increased speed and carried out a deliberate attack against the identified U-boat. He used the forward-throwing hedgehog bombs. The bombs hit the water, and a few seconds later, there were two distinct flashes, followed by signs of escaping air from the U-boat. It was a direct hit, and the U-boat rapidly broke apart. The escorts of ONS-5 had begun to strike back. They worked in a decisive manner. Over 2 days, in a series of carefully laid ambushes, they sank 4 more U-boats and severely damaged another 10. In the same period, not one U-boat had a successful attack on the convoy. ONS-5 remained intact. Although the convoy had lost 11 merchantmen during the voyage, the escorts had beaten off the largest wolf pack that Doenitz had deployed. 7 U-boats had been sunk, and many others severely damaged or sank later. Demoralized by their defeat against ONS-5, the surviving U-boats withdrew. A delighted Max Horton sent a congratulatory signal to ONS-5. So did Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Both recognized that this had been a decisive victory, snatched from the gaping jaws of defeat. Now supported throughout by air cover, most of the convoy's merchant ships reached their destinations at Halifax and St. John's by May 11th. Commander Raymond Hart said afterwards, "We really felt that at last our training and technology had got on top of the U-boat threat." It was a sudden reversal in the Allies' fortunes in the Atlantic. Between April and the end of May 1943, Doenitz's losses rose from 13% of his U-boats at sea to over 30%. In May 1943 alone, Doenitz lost 41 vessels. In one of them, he lost his younger son, who was himself a U-boat captain. Worse for the U-boats, by mid-1943, the notorious Black Gap was finally closed. Now the Allies had full air coverage across the vital Atlantic artery with a combination of small escort carriers and the very long-range B-24 Liberator bomber. A desperate Doenitz ordered a temporary withdrawal of his U-boats from the Atlantic. The battle against ONS-5 had been a significant turning point. In spite of new technological advances, such as the introduction of the Schnorkel and more powerful submarines, the U-boats would never present a threat to the Western Allies' lifeline. Doenitz's U-boats achieved enormous damage, sinking nearly 3,000 Allied merchant ships and 145 warships. The wolf packs very nearly brought Britain to its knees, but the cost was ultimately massive. The Germans built nearly 1,200 U-boats and lost 785. 70% of the crews that served in them perished during the war. Of the 44 U-boats engaged against ONS-5, every one was to be sunk or lost at sea by the end of the war. On the Allied side, of 145,000 merchant seamen engaged, 32,000 lost their lives during the Battle of the Atlantic. Grand Admiral Karl Doenitz served Hitler loyally until the end, despite his Führer's failure to back the U-boat campaign when it could have been decisive. In April 1945, Hitler announced that Doenitz was to be his successor. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Doenitz briefly became the head of a desolate and defeated Germany, brokering peace terms with the victorious Allies. At Nuremberg in 1946, he was indicted for war crimes and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Doenitz served his sentence at Spandau prison in Berlin alongside other former Nazis, such as Rudolf Hess and Albert Speer. Tragically, adding to the loss of both sons in the war, his wife Ingeborg also died shortly after he was released from Spandau prison in 1956. When he died in 1980, many U-boat veterans attended his funeral. Admiral Sir Max Horton remained in the Royal Navy until retiring in 1949 after an outstanding naval career in both wars. He had been an inspirational leader and was greatly respected by all naval ranks under his command. Sadly, his well-earned retirement was cut short by his untimely death in 1951. The Battle of the Atlantic was the one campaign that brought Hitler closest to winning the war. He failed mainly because he did not rely on his U-boats from the outset, and because the Allies had superior technology and resources. For those directly involved, it was a bitter campaign that tested the courage and tenacity of the Allied sailor and German submariner alike. Above all, it was fought against their common enemy, the cruel, forbidding seas of the Atlantic. For Karl Doenitz, it was a bitter, painful end to Germany's best chance to win the war. For Max Horton, their clash had been a triumph in the face of great adversity.